In the summer of 1941, Europe was already trembling under the weight of the German war machine. Country after country had fallen, crushed by the speed and brutality of the Nazi advance. At the center of this storm was Adolf Hitler, convinced that his destiny was to dominate the continent and now to go further. For him, the Soviet Union was not just an enemy, it was a prize. Vast land, rich in resources, and above all, an ideological obstacle that needed to be destroyed. Hitler believed that a quick blow, a lightning campaign like so many others, would be enough to make the Soviet colossus crumble. And that's how it was born. Operation Barbarossa. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the eastern sky exploded in flames. More than 3 million German soldiers advanced like an avalanche of steel and gunpowder. Tanks cut through the land, planes dove down dropping bombs, and artillery transformed the horizon into a continuous inferno. It was the largest invasion in human history. At first, everything seemed to confirm Hitler's beliefs. Soviet lines were torn apart, soldiers were surrounded, entire cities fell in a matter of days, thousands of prisoners marched under the threat of guns, while the ground was littered with bodies and debris. For the Germans, it was as if they were repeating a perfect formula: attack quickly, surround, destroy, advance. Confidence grew with each kilometer gained. German generals spoke of victory before winter. Many soldiers believed they would be back home before Christmas. The enemy seemed disorganized, weak, unable to resist the power of the Blitzkrieg. But behind that confidence lay something dangerous: underestimation. They weren't just entering enemy territory, they were entering a different world. A world too vast to be conquered quickly. A world where distances swallowed entire armies. A world where the weather could kill as easily as a bullet. And at that moment, nobody, not even Hitler, could see what really lay ahead. Because while the tanks advanced and the initial victories fueled the dream of conquest, something silent and relentless was beginning to approach: the Russian winter, and he would not forgive anyone. The attack began before many Soviet soldiers even understood what was happening. In the heavy silence of the early morning of June 22, 1941, the horizon simply opened up in flames. German bombers crisscrossed the still dark sky, showering death upon airfields, ammunition depots, and communication centers. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground without even taking off. It was the beginning of an offensive so swift and brutal that it seemed impossible to stop. 3 large German army groups advanced simultaneously, each with a clear objective: the northern group towards Leningrad, the central group towards Moscow, and the southern group advancing towards the wealthy Ukraine. Together, they numbered millions of men, thousands of tanks, and an air force that completely dominated the skies. It was a perfectly coordinated war machine, cold, efficient, devastating. On the ground, progress was almost unreal. The armored divisions, the famous Panzers, they cut through Soviet territory like sharp blades. They didn't fight traditional battles, they surrounded. They advanced deep, ignoring minor resistance, leaving behind pockets of isolated Soviet troops, which were then crushed by the infantry that followed closely behind. Within days, entire cities were engulfed. Roads were clogged with refugees, entire families fleeing on foot in makeshift carts, carrying everything they could salvage. But there was nowhere to run. The war was everywhere. Caught off guard, the Soviet soldiers fought as best they could. Many didn't even have clear orders. Entire units were surrounded and destroyed before they understood the scale of the attack. In some places, the resistance was fierce, men fighting to their last cartridge, to their last breath. But more often than not, they were simply swallowed up by German speed. And then came the sieges. Large pockets of Soviet troops were closed in like death traps. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped, without food, without ammunition, without hope. Some tried to escape, crossing fields under machine gun fire, being slaughtered en masse. Others surrendered, marching in long columns under armed guard towards an uncertain and often deadly fate. The ground in the Soviet Union was beginning to turn into a graveyard. Destroyed tanks smoldered along the roads, soldiers' bodies piled up in fields and forests. The air held the smell of gunpowder, burnt oil, and death. It was a war of rapid movement, but it left behind a trail of utter destruction. For the Germans, this seemed like confirmation that they were invincible. Optimistic reports arrived constantly. Generals spoke of the total collapse of the Red Army. Nazi propaganda reinforced the idea that victory was near, that the Soviet Union would fall like a house of cards. But there were signs, small, almost ignored. The distances were enormous. Supply lines were beginning to stretch dangerously. The territory seemed endless. And even as they were being crushed, the Soviets continued fighting. Retreating, yes, but never disappearing completely. Still, at that moment, nobody wanted to see it. German confidence was only growing. The feeling was clear. The war was practically won. They advanced deeper, faster, more confidently, without realizing it. With every kilometer gained, they were moving further away from any real chance of victory. The advance to the heart of the Soviet Union. As the weeks passed, the German advance ceased to be merely impressive. It became almost unbelievable. It was as if nothing could stop that iron march. With each passing day, more kilometers were conquered, more cities were swallowed up, more Soviet troops were destroyed or captured. Army Group Center, the most powerful of all, was advancing straight for the heart of the Soviet Union. Its objective was clear: Moscow. The capital was not just a political symbol, it was the nerve center of the country. Railways, communications, military command. Everything passed through there. If Moscow fell, many believed the entire Soviet structure would collapse with it. And at that moment, it seemed entirely possible. German forces continued to apply their strategy with surgical precision. Surround, isolate, destroy. In gigantic battles like Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Endless columns of prisoners marched under the sun, weakened, hungry, many already too weak to continue. Those who fell often never got up again. The war wasn't just fast, it was merciless. Meanwhile, German tanks continued advancing along dusty roads, raising clouds that could be seen for miles. The infantry followed close behind, exhausted but spurred on by a sense of victory. The officers spoke more and more openly. Moscow was within reach, but progress came at a price, and it was beginning to show. Supply lines were being stretched to their limits. Trucks traveled absurd distances to deliver fuel, food, and ammunition to the front lines. Often, these supplies simply didn't arrive in time. Soldiers began to feel the lack of basic items. Tanks sometimes had to stop, not because of damage, but because of a lack of fuel. Even so, the progress did not stop. The Germans passed through abandoned villages, burned fields and cities partially, destroyed by the Soviets themselves, who adopted a desperate tactic: scorched earth. Everything that could be useful to the enemy was destroyed before the retreat. Warehouses were set on fire, crops burned, and railway tracks sabotaged. It was like advancing into territory that was being slowly emptied and killed. And yet, they continued. In the distance, Moscow was beginning to become more than just a strategic objective. It was becoming an obsession. The soldiers spoke of it as the end of the journey, the final victory, the point where everything would end. But something was changing. Soviet resistance, though still disorganized in many places, was beginning to harden. New troops were arriving. Localized counterattacks were happening more frequently. The enemy was no longer just retreating. It was beginning to fight back. And there was another detail, subtle but growing: the climate. The days were getting shorter. The air was getting colder. The nights were getting longer. First it seemed irrelevant, just a natural change. Nothing that could affect such a powerful war machine. But that land, it wasn't like the other lands the Germans had conquered. There, time was not merely a condition, It was a weapon, and it hadn't even been fully revealed yet. The first warning sign. Then, almost without warning, the progress began to slow down. Not because of a great battle, not because of a crushing defeat, but because of something much simpler and much more dangerous. The world has changed. The rains began to fall steadily, heavily, relentlessly. The grey sky closed in over the battlefield, and the dry summer ground quickly turned into a sea of thick mud. It was the beginning of the dreaded Rasputitsa, a phenomenon that few Germans truly understood, and which would soon come to dominate every movement of that war. The roads have disappeared. Where once there were organized columns of tanks and trucks, now there were slippery, deep tracks, almost impossible to cross. Vehicles began to get stuck, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Trucks loaded with fuel sank up to their axles. Tanks spun their tracks without moving, trapped like animals in invisible snares. The progress, once swift and precise, was now slow, frustrating, almost suffocating. Soldiers climbed out of the vehicles and tried to push tons of steel with their bare hands, immersed up to their knees, sometimes even their waists, in that cold, sticky mud. Boots were ripped from their feet. Equipment fell and disappeared into the mud. Every step required effort. Every meter gained seemed like a victory. And the worst part, there was no way to avoid it. The few paved roads were overcrowded. Long lines of vehicles formed, creating easy targets for Soviet attacks. Off the roads, it was absolute chaos. Abandoned carts, dead horses, trucks tilted at impossible angles. Modern warfare was being swallowed up by a primitive enemy, the very soil itself. Meanwhile, supplies began to run out. Food was slow to arrive. Ammunition was becoming scarce in critical areas. Fuel, vital for keeping the tanks running, was becoming increasingly difficult to transport. Some advanced units simply stopped, not for lack of will, but for lack of means to continue. And the Soviets realized it. They knew that land. They knew what the mud would do to the enemy. Small attacks began to emerge, quick, unexpected. Soviet troops would appear out of nowhere, strike trapped columns, and disappear again. It wasn't yet a major counterattack, but it was a clear warning. The enemy was still alive. For the German soldiers, the sensation was new and uncomfortable. That war, which until then had seemed like a triumphant march, was beginning to show cracks. Confidence still existed, but now it was accompanied by frustration, irritation, exhaustion, and for the first time, doubt. Because it wasn't just the enemy that was resisting, it was the environment itself. If the mud was already capable of stopping tanks, delaying armies and disrupting the pace of the invasion, then what came next could be much worse than any of them were prepared to face. Winter is beginning to fall. The mud still trapped men and machines when the air began to change. At first it was subtle, a more intense chill at dawn, a sharper wind piercing through the uniforms. The soldiers' breath began to appear in the air, forming small white clouds. Nothing that seemed truly dangerous yet. But then the cold deepened. The rains gave way to frost. Overnight the mud hardened, creating an uneven, treacherous surface. By morning, vehicles that had previously been stuck were now trapped in frozen positions, as if the ground itself had permanently captured them. And then came the snow. First thin, almost beautiful, a white blanket covering the devastated fields, temporarily softening the scars of war. But that appearance was deceiving. Soon the snow became denser, more constant, covering roads, burying debris, hiding dangers. And with her came the true enemy. The temperature plummeted violently, -10 degrees, -20, in some regions -30 degrees Celsius. A cold that not only bothered, it penetrated. It saw through clothing, pierced the skin, reached the bones. A cold that burned. The German soldiers were not prepared for that. Their uniforms were made for quick campaigns, not for surviving a Russian winter. Many still wore summer gear, improvising with whatever they could. Find blankets, scraps of fabric, anything that could help block the wind. But nothing seemed enough. During the night, the suffering was even worse. Men huddled together in makeshift shelters, trying to share body heat. Some couldn't sleep because of the intense cold. Others simply didn't wake up. They died silently, frozen, without a single shot fired. The fingers and toes of the hands and feet began to darken. Frostbite became an invisible enemy. First came numbness, then acute pain, and then a nothing, dead tissue. In many cases, the only solution was amputation, without proper anesthesia, without ideal conditions. Just survival. And it wasn't just the men. The weapons were starting to malfunction. Oil froze inside the mechanisms. Rifles jammed at the most critical moment. Machine guns stopped firing. Soldiers tried to warm their weapons with their hands, with their breath, sometimes even with fire, risking damage to the equipment. The engines suffered the same fate. Tanks and trucks simply refused to start. Fires had to be lit under the engines to try and warm them up before starting. Even then, it was often useless. The German war machine, which had once advanced with relentless precision, now struggled simply to exist. Meanwhile, the Soviets were beginning to move with more freedom. Accustomed to the cold and better equipped for that climate, they saw winter as an opportunity. For them, that environment was not an obstacle, it was an advantage. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a nightmare, a silent, invisible enemy, impossible to defeat. The Russian winter had arrived, and he was in no hurry to finish what he had started. Weapons freeze, machines die. The cold was not only punishing the men, it was beginning to destroy, piece by piece, the entire machinery of the German war effort. At first, they were isolated failures, a rifle that wouldn't fire, a truck that was slow to start, nothing that seemed out of control. But as the days went by, these failures multiplied until they became the new reality on the front lines. The metal reacted cruelly to the cold. The internal mechanisms of the weapons began to jam. The oil, essential for keeping everything running smoothly, thickened as if turning into glue. Bolts wouldn't move, triggers stiffened. In many cases, the soldier would press the trigger and nothing would happen. In the heat of battle, that meant death. There were reports of desperate German soldiers banging their rifles against the frozen ground, trying to get them working again as the enemy closed in. Others disassembled their weapons with trembling hands, exposing fingers already almost numb to the freezing air, in an attempt to remove the oil and get them running dry. But there wasn't always enough time. The machine guns, which had once swept across the battlefield with devastating power, now failed at the most critical moments. A sudden silence, followed by the enemy advance. And if the weapons failed, the machines suffered even more. The German tanks, the pride of the Blitzkrieg, were beginning to become motionless carcasses in the ice. During the night, the cold penetrated deep into the engines. In the morning, starting them was a struggle. Often, they simply wouldn't start. Entire crews spent hours trying to revive those machines, lighting fires under the engines, burning wood, fuel, anything that could generate heat. Some succeeded, many did not. And when a tank stopped, it became a target. Supply trucks faced the same fate. Entire lines of abandoned vehicles began to appear along the frozen roads. No fuel, no maintenance, no conditions to operate. German logistics, already stretched to its limit, was beginning to collapse. And without logistics, there is no war. Without enough food, the soldiers weakened. Without ammunition, they became vulnerable. Without fuel, there was no progress, only stagnation. It was as if winter itself was dismantling the German army, slowly, methodically. And there was something even more cruel. Even their bodies reacted to the cold, like machines breaking down. Frozen fingers made any simple task difficult. Holding a weapon, pressing a button, tying a boot. Reaction time slowed. Reasoning became sluggish. The cold drained energy, drained willpower, drained life. The soldiers were beginning to realize something terrible. They were no longer fighting just a human enemy. They were fighting against an environment that could not be intimidated. could not be deceived, and definitely could not be defeated with military strategy. German superiority, the kind that had seemed absolute weeks before, was fading, not because of a great battle, but because of thousands of small glitches happening at the same time. Guns that won't fire, engines that won't start, bodies that don't respond. The most powerful war machine in Europe was being silenced, not by shooting, but because of the cold. Soldiers against nature. The collapse of weapons and machines was not merely a mechanical failure, it was the prelude to a primordial tragedy, where war, once a duel of armored titans and roaring cannons, was reduced to something infinitely more savage, more merciless, more ancient. It was now naked man against naked nature, and nature, that merciless goddess of ice and wind, was not only winning, but devouring, crushing, extinguishing souls with a slowness that transformed each second into an eternity of agony. The cold was no longer a mere discomfort, passing annoyance that dissipated with the lighting of a fire or the wrapping of a blanket. No, it was a living, omnipresent entity that seeped into every pore of the skin, every crevice of the spirit, burning the lungs as if the air were made of sharp blades of ice. With each breath, the chest contracted in a spasm of excruciating pain, as if the oxygen itself solidified into needles piercing the alveoli. The wind, howling like a pack of hungry wolves, cut the exposed face with the precision of an invisible executioner, leaving red furrows that soon filled with crusts of ice. And the ground, the ground, was a treacherous carpet of compacted snow that concealed deadly traps. Frozen puddles that opened like hungry mouths, swallowing boots and feet in an embrace that never let go. The German soldiers, those proud sons of the Blitzkrieg, awoke already exhausted, as if sleep were a luxury stolen by nocturnal demons. Sleeping in those conditions was a torment worse than wakefulness. Many spent the endless hours of the night trembling uncontrollably, their teeth chattering in a frenetic rhythm that echoed like a damned man's drum, their muscles contracting in desperate spasms to generate a wisp of warmth. The most resilient fought with constant movements, flexing their fingers, stamping their feet, murmuring forgotten prayers to Mother Germany. But fatigue was a slow poison that seeped into their veins. Others, the most exhausted, simply stopped trembling. And this bodily silence was the most terrible sign of all, because when the body, in its ancestral wisdom, gave up fighting the cold, death did not arrive with a dramatic blow, but like an icy whisper, first the bluish lips, then the glazed eyes, and finally absolute nothingness. Men who had marched through Poland and France, invincible under the summer sun, now lay motionless, transformed into statues of frozen flesh, their faces contorted into a final mask of pure terror. The clothes, the clothes, grey uniforms, designed for lightning campaigns, for the heat of the Ukrainian steppes under the July sun, now proved to be inadequate shrouds. Lightweight fabrics that couldn't withstand temperatures plummeting to 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero. The leather of the boots cracked like glass under the ice, the woolen gloves disintegrated into useless shreds. In desperation, the soldiers improvised with a creativity born of panic. Old newspapers crumpled inside their boots to create an illusory barrier against the cold. Pieces of curtains torn from abandoned houses, wrapped like makeshift shrouds around their torsos. Civilian coats stolen from looted villages, reeking of smoke and the fear of others. But nothing was enough. Nothing was ever enough. The cold penetrated like a sadistic lover, devouring the body's warmth inch by inch. And the feet, those feet that had borne the weight of conquest, were the first victims sacrificed on nature's altar. The freezing began subtly, with a treacherous, almost comforting numbness, as if the body offered an illusory truce. Then came the pain, an excruciating agony, as if thousands of incandescent needles pierced the skin, the nerves screaming in unison. Next, the terrifying silence of insensibility. The toes stiffened, darkened, became black as coal, swollen and putrid. When, in makeshift shelters, holes dug in the snow or ruins of destroyed izbas, the boots were finally torn off, the horror revealed itself in all its cruelty. Dead, gangrenous, flesh, exuding a sweet and nauseating odor of decomposition. The decision was brutal, inescapable: amputate or die. Without adequate field hospitals, without sufficient anesthesia, the field surgeons, men whose hands trembled as much as those of their patients, used rusty saws, knives sharpened on stones, and stolen Russian whiskey as their only painkiller. Screams echoed through the camp, mingling with the howling wind, a chorus of agony lost in the white vastness. Men once strong, trained for Aryan heroism, reduced to contorted bodies, pleading for mercy in languages silenced by the cold. Hands were no exception to their fate. Fingers that once gripped triggers with lethal precision now became stiff, swollen, useless. A second without gloves, just a second to light a cigarette, adjust a sight, clean a wound, was enough to seal the verdict. Skin cracked, nails fell off, and the soldier watched, with eyes wide with terror, his own flesh transform into something alien, dead. Holding a weapon became torture, pulling the trigger, an impossible act of heroism. Many preferred to die fighting than face the slow erosion of dignity. But it wasn't just the body that surrendered. The mind, that ultimate fortress of the human being, began to crack like ice under the tanks. The constant cold, the fatigue that accumulated in geological layers of exhaustion, the hunger that gnawed at the insides like a starving rat, the fear that seeped into dreams. Everything conspired to create an invisible, crushing weight that bent the backs of even the strongest. Soldiers lost all sense of time. Days and nights merged into an eternal twilight of snow and darkness. Some fell into a catatonic silence, eyes fixed on the white void, murmuring the names of mothers, fiancés, children left behind in distant villages. Others exploded in absurd panics. A branch breaking in the wind became a Soviet tank. A shadow in the snow, an entire regiment. Hallucinations took over, visions of flowery, Bavarian fields, of smoking Berlin chimneys, dissolving into ghostly laughter. Despair was becoming palpable, a fog that suffocated the soul. Men who had sung hymns of victory now wept like children, pleading for a liberating bullet, for an end that winter cruelly denied them. The war had changed in nature. It was no longer about advancing miles, conquering cities, raising flags. It was about surviving until the next dawn, a dawn that, when it arrived, brought only more cold, more snow, more death. The tanks, once symbols of invincible power, lay motionless, engines frozen, fuel solidified in the lines. Horses, those faithful pack animals, fell in heaps, their legs broken in the ice, their eyes glazed with animal terror, serving as the last meal for soldiers who, days before, would have refused such meat with disgust. And in the midst of this desolation, the Soviet enemy observed, adapted, became part of the landscape. Dressed in sheepskins, wearing felt Valenki boots that defied the Yar's ice, camouflaged in white like ghosts of the steppe, the Russians moved with supernatural grace. Skiers appeared out of nowhere, gliding across terrain that, to the Germans, was an insurmountable wall. Small, silent units emerged from the infinite whiteness, fired precise bursts of fire, and vanished like mist. To the soldiers of the Reich, this was pure supernatural terror, an invisible enemy fused with murderous nature that attacked not with open fury, but with the cunning of an ancient predator. The infinite white concealed everything and revealed only death. Slowly, like a truth imposing itself on the threshold of madness, the realization settled in German hearts. They were not prepared, not for that war of ice and hunger. Not for that place where the horizon was lost in endless snow, and above all, not for that relentless winter that knew no mercy. that devoured living men day after day, hour after hour, turning heroes into walking corpses. A winter that whispered in the wind, "You came to conquer, but I conquered you first." Soviet resistance gains strength. While the Germans fought a losing battle against their own bodies and against the white demon that surrounded them, something dark and inexorable began to stir on the other side of the invisible front line. The Soviet Union, that colossus which in the summer of 1941 had seemed to tremble at its foundations under the weight of the lightning invasion, did not crumble. On the contrary, the initial chaos, the panic of the first weeks, the apparent collapse of entire divisions, all that gave way to a resistance born from the ashes of despair, transforming into a fierce, almost fanatical determination that chilled the blood of the invaders more than the cold itself. Under the command of Joseph Stalin, the man of steel whose name echoed like a divine verdict across the steppes, one order resounded throughout the vast empire: resist at all costs. There was no retreat, no surrender, no mercy for the weak. And the people obeyed, not out of blind love, but out of a primal terror that united the fear of the invader with the fear of the regime itself. New troops emerged like specters from the depths of Siberia, from those icy confines where winter was not the enemy, but the cradle. These soldiers were not mere reinforcements. They were children of the tundra, accustomed from birth to temperatures that would make an ordinary German beg for mercy. Equipped with padded uniforms, felt boots that kept their feet dry and warm, fur-lined coats that defied the wind, and white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They glided across the terrain like natural predators. While a German struggled to take a single step, sinking up to his knees, the Siberians skied with ghostly speed, crossing frozen forests and solidified rivers in minutes. The difference was not only brutal, it was terrifying, a humiliation that corroded the German soul like acid. These men used winter as a sharp weapon. They moved along secret trails known only to wolves, and the spirits of the tiger appeared where least expected, attacked with silent fury, and disappeared before the echo of the shots dissipated. For the exhausted and frozen Wehrmacht soldiers, this was the pinnacle of terror. The enemy was no longer an organized army with visible columns and roaring tanks. It was a haunting presence. A lone shot from an ambushed sniper, a grenade launched from a snow dune, an attack from the rear that left trails of fresh blood on the immaculate white. And then silence, a silence that returned, leaving only rigid bodies, eyes wide open in eternal astonishment, as if death had surprised them in the midst of a nightmare. At the same time, the Soviet command, with a strategic coldness bordering on sadistic genius, reorganized the defenses with surgical precision. Fortified lines sprouted from the frozen earth like the quills of a colossal porcupine. Trenches dug by civilian hands. Men, women, children, the elderly bent under the weight of shovels, formed deadly labyrinths around strategic points. Moscow, the beating heart of Mother Russia, was transformed into a living fortress, pulsating with rage and determination. Entire factories were dismantled and sent to the distant Urals, where the ice did not stop production, but fueled it. New tanks rolled off the assembly lines, still warm, painted white to blend into the landscape. Airplanes, cannons, ammunition, everything flowed like vital. Blood to a body that refused to bleed to death. It was a total mobilization, a war of the entire people, where the front stretched from the trenches to the kitchens of the izbas. Women operated heavy machinery with calloused hands. Children carried buckets of hot soup for the soldiers. Old men dug anti-tank barriers with backs bent by rheumatism. The initial despair had given way to a collective fury, an iron will forged in the fire of the invasion, even after losses that would have destroyed any other army. Millions dead, cities razed, crops burned in scorched earth tactics. The Red Army did not break. New divisions emerged from the endless reserves of the East, T-34 tanks, more resistant to the cold than the German Panzers, rolled over the snow with tracks that did not slip. Industrial production relocated beyond the reach of bombers fueled the war machine at a pace that the Germans, with their supply lines stretched to the limit, could not match. For the invaders, it was a nightmare that deepened day by day. They had imagined a swift collapse, a humiliating surrender, a victory that would echo through the centuries as the greatest Aryan achievement. Instead, they faced something that refused to die, a hydra with countless heads, cutting off one and seeing two grow back stronger. The German lines, once confident and aggressive, now stretched like ropes about to snap, vulnerable to counterattacks coming from all sides. Morale, once as high as the swastika banner, crumbled under the weight of the cold, hunger, and the growing certainty that the enemy was not merely human, it was Russia itself, eternal, implacable, vengeful. And then, little by little, like the first ray of a bloody dawn, the balance shifted. The Germans stopped advancing with the arrogance of conquerors. Their troops, exhausted and decimated, now fought for mere survival. The Soviets, in turn, gained not only material strength, but something more dangerous: confidence, time, and an unholy alliance with the winter that the Germans so feared. That same cold that devoured the invaders became the shield and sword of the defenders. Soviet lightning attacks, precise counteroffensives, launched with calculated fury, began to bite at the edges of the German lines, forcing humiliating retreats, leaving behind abandoned equipment, frozen tanks, soldiers who preferred their own bullets to the slow embrace of the snow. A new phase of the war was unfolding on the white, dark, and inescapable horizon. The hunters, those who had marched with the pride of the invincible, were beginning, slowly and inexorably, to become the prey. The terror they once instilled now turned against them, multiplied 1,000-fold. The despair they felt was the echo of an entire nation rising from the ashes, not to survive, but to hunt. And in the midst of that icy vastness, the wind carried a whisper that chilled even the hardest souls. The Russian winter was not just a season, it was a verdict, and it had chosen its side: the brutal counterattack. And then, when the Germans were already at the absolute limit of human endurance, exhausted to the marrow of their bones, frozen in an agony that turned every movement into torment, disorganized like an army of ghosts wandering through a white cemetery, the blow came, not as a whisper, not as a distant threat. It came as a primal roar, without warning, without pity, without the slightest shadow of mercy. It was the beginning of December 1941. The cold, that invisible monster that had already devoured thousands, had reached almost unimaginable levels, 40, 50 degrees below zero, making the air crackle like shattered glass. The sky, an opaque leaden dome, seemed to weigh on souls like a coffin lid. The soldiers of the Reich, huddled in shallow trenches that barely protected them from the howling wind, could hardly believe that hell could get any worse. But it did, and it worsened in a way that no campaign plan, no order from Berlin could have foreseen. Suddenly, the oppressive white silence of the snow was torn apart by a thunderous artillery fire that made the earth tremble as if the planet itself were rebelling. Soviet cannons, positioned deep within the snow, spewed fire and death in a deafening symphony. Explosions raised columns of snow, earth, and metal, mingling with fresh blood in a spectacle of red horror against the immaculate white. The air, already biting, now burned with the acrid smell of cordite and charred flesh. German positions, already fragile as sandcastles under the tide, began to crumble. Makeshift shelters collapsed. Frozen machine guns fell silent forever. Panzer tanks, once the pride of the Blitzkrieg, lay motionless, engines seized by the ice, like sleeping giants that would never awaken. And then they came, not in orderly formations, not with the martial step of the Nuremberg parades. They came like a living avalanche, a human tide that sprang from nowhere. Waves of Soviet soldiers advancing, through the snow with a speed and determination that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Fresh troops hailed from the depths of Siberia, ghostly skiers gliding along the sides of the German lines, crossing frozen forests where the enemy could barely crawl. They emerged from the white dunes like vengeful spirits, white uniforms merging into the landscape, faces hardened by the eternal wind, eyes gleaming with a fury that winter had failed to extinguish. There was no rest. There was no time to react. The Germans, weakened to their core, tried to defend themselves tooth and nail, but their bodies betrayed them every second. Rigid hands could barely hold the rifle. Triggers jammed by the ice refused to fire. Legs that barely felt the ground stumbled with every step. Many couldn't even dig new defensive positions in the ground that seemed made of solid stone. Others fought with weapons that simply didn't respond, as if the metal itself had allied itself with the enemy, and the Red Army didn't stop. Attacks came from all sides, day and night, under snowstorms that reduced visibility to a few meters. The chaos was absolute. Shouts in Russian mingling with the howling wind, explosions that illuminated the darkness like infernal fireworks, shadows that materialized into gleaming bayonets. This shattered the soldiers' minds. Fear spread like a fast, invisible poison. Entire units, once disciplined to death, began to retreat without clear orders, their eyes wide with terror, murmuring forgotten prayers or simply running in blind panic. Communication failed, radios frozen, messengers lost in the whiteness. Officers tried to reorganize the lines with hoarse voices, but it was too late. Panic had already taken deep root. The German advance, the one that had seemed irresistible months before, had stopped not with a bang, but with an agonizing sigh. Now it was a forced retreat. And this retreat was not organized, glorious, or strategic. It was desperate, animalistic, a primal escape. Men abandoned heavy equipment, mortars, ammunition boxes, even machine guns, to manage to move one more meter. Armored vehicles were left behind, engines dead, wheels stuck in the ice, like relics of a crumbling empire. Wounded men groaned on makeshift stretchers, begging for help with voices lost in the wind. Some were carried by exhausted comrades until the weight became unbearable, and then they were left in silence, knowing that the cold would do the rest. The snow, once pure and virginal, began to fill with bodies. Bodies frozen in grotesque combat positions, one soldier still with his finger on the lock trigger, another kneeling as if in prayer, glazed eyes staring into nothingness. The pure white was stained with deep red, pools of blood that froze almost instantly, creating a surreal carpet of horror that seemed straight out of a feverish nightmare, but was brutally, inescapably true. And the Soviets kept pressing. Every kilometer recaptured was a profound humiliation, living proof that the war had changed hands. German confidence, once unshakable as Krupp steel, was now broken into 1,000 pieces. The enemy they thought already defeated, already collapsing, revealed itself stronger, more alive, more ruthless than ever. And the winter remained by their side, like a faithful ally, a vengeful god whispering in the wind. You came as conquerors. Now you die as intruders. There was no longer any doubt. This was no longer a glorious campaign of conquest. It was a brutal, primitive struggle for survival. And the Germans, those who had dreamed of an eternal empire, were losing not only territory, but their very soul. The German collapse in Moscow was right there, so close that some German soldiers, on the clearest and coldest nights, swore they could see the distant gleam of golden domes on the horizon, a will-o'-the-wisp that mocked them like a mirage of paradise lost. After months of bloody advance, of victories that seemed written in the history books, of blood spilled in entire rivers, the final objective, the beating heart of the Soviet Union, seemed within reach of trembling hands. All it took was one last push, one last effort, or so they believed. But it was a cruel illusion, the most perverse of all. The army that had reached the gates of Moscow was no longer the same one that had crossed the Polish border in June, with gleaming tanks and victory hymns on its lips. It was exhausted, to the brink of humanity, fragmented into ghost units, consumed by the bone-chilling cold, the hunger that gnawed at its insides, the constant wear and tear of a campaign that had turned into an endless nightmare. That force that once advanced like a sharp blade through butter could now barely stand, staggering like drunkards on a frozen battlefield. And Moscow was not defenseless. Far from it. The city had been transformed into a living fortress, pulsating with collective rage and determination. Deep defensive lines cut into the ground like open scars. Anti-tank trenches that looked like black abysses in the snow. Minefields hidden beneath layers of treacherous white, makeshift barricades of overturned trams, sandbags, and furniture ripped from houses. Every entrance, every road, every possible route of advance had been prepared to resist to the last breath. Entire factories had been evacuated to the east, but those that remained produced ammunition day and night under constant bombardment. And there was something more, something the Germans hadn't foreseen in their arrogant maps. Men, thousands, tens of thousands of them, soldiers newly arrived from the Siberian vastness, accustomed to winters that would make a Bavarian tremble at the mere thought, equipped with furs and felts that defied the ice. Armed civilians, laborers, teachers, housewives, transformed into improvised combatants with rifles in their calloused hands and hatred in their eyes. Workers who, days before, had built tanks now defended them with their lives, all ready to die for Mother Russia, for the city that symbolized the soul of the nation. When the Germans attempted their final advance, they encountered resistance at every meter, every inch of frozen ground. The fighting ceased to be swift and glorious. It became slow, heavy, suffocating, a human meat grinder. Every position had to be conquered by brute force with bayonets and hand grenades in hand-to-hand combat where warm, breath condensed in the icy air. Each advance cost countless lives. And unlike the beginning of the campaign, now it was the Germans who faced a determined, well-positioned, increasingly confident enemy. An enemy who knew that time and the cold were on their side. The cold offered no respite. During the night, temperatures plummeted even further, transforming the camp into a living mausoleum. Men awoke with stiff bodies, muscles locked, unable to move quickly to respond to an alarm. Some didn't even wake. Eternal sleep carried them silently, their faces blue and serene like marble statues. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the scent of death and defeat. And then came the final blow. The Soviet counterattack, already underway since the first days of December, struck the German lines before Moscow with full force. There was no more room for advance, only for retreat, for the humiliation of fleeing. Orders from Berlin echoed like death sentences. Hold position at all costs. Entire units were isolated, surrounded without supplies, without reinforcements, without hope. Some resisted to the last man, singing hymns that the wind carried away. Others simply disappeared into the snow, swallowed by the chaos of the retreat, bodies vanishing under new white layers as if Russia were claiming them for itself. The attempt to take Moscow had failed, not with a dramatic bang, but with a collective groan of agony. And this failure was more than military. It was psychological. It was the death of a dream. For the first time, the idea of defeat ceased to be unthinkable. The German soldiers, who had previously marched with the divine certainty of Aryan victory, now retreated under the crushing weight of harsh reality. The enemy had not fallen. The war was not near its end. In fact, it was only beginning to show its true face, a face of ice, blood, and infinite fury. Around Moscow, the frozen ground bore the price of that colossal mistake. bodies scattered in grotesque positions, abandoned vehicles with doors ajar like mouths screaming in silence, equipment left behind, fallen cannons, empty ammunition boxes, tanks with broken tracks. All of this was proof of a truth impossible to ignore, a truth that burned more than the cold. Nazi Germany had been stopped, not for lack of power, not for weakness of arms or men, but because it had underestimated something far greater than any army, older than any ideology: winter, and the resilience of a people who refused to disappear. And at that moment, before the Soviet capital that stood like an unwavering beacon in the storm, the dream of a quick victory died forever. It died frozen, suffocated, buried under layers of snow that would soon also cover the names of those who dared to defy eternal Russia. The wind, carrying snowflakes like icy tears, seemed to laugh softly. You came to conquer the world, but the world swallowed you. And the long night of war had barely begun. After the failure against Moscow, the war entered an even more brutal phase, because now killing no longer depended solely on bullets or explosions. The greatest killer made no noise: the Russian winter. He didn't attack head-on. He didn't give clear signals. He couldn't be fought nor avoided. He was simply there, constant, relentless, killing slowly, every day. German soldiers began dying without ever seeing the enemy. During the night, the cold penetrated every layer of clothing, every makeshift shelter. Men went to sleep, trying to conserve energy, and didn't wake up. Their bodies were found in the morning, stiff, covered by a thin layer of ice, as if they had been slowly erased from existence. No shouting, no fight, just silence. In other cases, death was slower and more cruel. The frostbite spread through her body like an invisible disease. First her feet, then her hands, then her face. Noses and ears darkened, hardened, and died. The initial pain was unbearable, but the worst came later, when it completely disappeared. Because when the pain went away, it meant the tissue was already dead. And then came the amputations. Without adequate hospitals or sufficient medication, procedures were performed under brutal conditions. Knives, makeshift saws, men were held down while parts of their own bodies were removed to prevent something even worse: total death. Many didn't even survive that. And then there was the hunger. With supply lines collapsing, food became scarce, rations froze, becoming nearly impossible to consume. Some soldiers tried to heat food over small flames, but fuel was rare. Others simply ate what they could get, sometimes frozen, sometimes spoiled. The body was growing weaker, and a weak body cannot withstand the cold. Diseases began to spread: infections, extreme exhaustion, physical collapse. The medical evacuation system practically didn't function. Many wounded had nowhere to go. They stayed where they were, waiting for help that never came, or waiting for the end. And the most terrifying thing of all was that there was no way to react. You can fight against an enemy soldier, against a tank. You can take cover. Against winter, there was no strategy. He was in every breath, in every step, in every second. The Germans began to understand that they were facing something completely beyond human control, something that could not be defeated with discipline, courage, or technology, something that simply consumed me. And so, day after day, night after night, winter continued its silent work. No rush, without mercy, transforming the German army into a shadow of its former self, not through great battles, but through thousands of unseen deaths. Deaths that didn't make it into glorious reports, but together they were destroying everything. What was once a fast-paced campaign based on speed and shock had transformed into something completely different. The war was now slow, heavy, suffocating. Every move demanded extreme effort. Every decision carried immediate consequences. There was no such thing as easy progress, no such thing as quick victory. The battlefield had transformed into a frozen hell, where surviving was as difficult as fighting. The The front lines have ceased to be fluid. Now, they were static positions, buried in the snow and ice. Makeshift trenches cut through the frozen ground, often too shallow to offer real protection. The rock-hard soil made digging nearly impossible. Shelters were flimsy, poorly constructed, unable to block the biting wind that swept through everything. The soldiers lived there, days, weeks, sometimes longer, always exposed, always freezing, always waiting. The fight has changed too. It was no longer about large, quick maneuvers. Now it was about close, brutal, often chaotic confrontations. Small attacks, constant skirmishes, advances of a few meters followed by immediate counterattacks. Every piece of ground was violently contested, and the cold was present every second of it. Weapons still malfunctioned. Stiff fingers made firing difficult. The simple act of reloading a rifle could take too long enough to die. Grenades slipped from numb hands. Soldiers fought not only against the enemy, but against their own bodies. Visibility was another enemy. Snowstorms would appear without warning, covering everything in white. It was impossible to see beyond a few meters. Sounds were muffled. Orientation was easily lost. In many cases, entire units would become disorganized. Simply because they couldn't see each other. It was chaos, silent, and then came the attacks. The Soviets, now more confident, pressed on constantly. Small units infiltrated the German lines, attacking vulnerable points. At night, the fear was even greater. Any sound could mean an imminent attack. Sleep, when it came, was light and interrupted. Nobody relaxed. Nobody was safe. The war had turned into pure attrition, physical, mental, emotional. The German soldiers no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of resistance, of surviving the next day, of enduring another cold night, and even that wasn't always possible. The battlefield seemed frozen in time, but the destruction continued. Bodies piled up, often preserved by the cold, as if they were part of the landscape itself. Abandoned equipment became silent reminders of past failures. Everything around was a constant reminder that this war had changed, and there was no turning back. What should have been a quick campaign had become a brutal conflict of attrition, where time, cold, and Soviet resistance worked together, slowly crushing the enemy. And in that scenario, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Germany was not prepared for a war like this. A war where speed is not the key to victory, but where it gets lost, little by little. At first they marched with confidence. Now they could barely stay on their feet. What the cold, hunger, and constant combat hadn't physically destroyed was beginning to crumble. From within, the morale of the German army, once considered unshakable, was beginning to collapse, slowly, silently, but irreversibly. The soldiers no longer spoke of victory. They talked about surviving. Conversations that once revolved around conquests, strategies, and returning home were now replaced by something much simpler and much darker. Food, warmth, and rest. Basic things. Things that at that moment seemed impossible. The fatigue was constant. It wasn't just physical, it was mental. An invisible weight that accumulated day after day. The lack of sleep, the incessant cold, the constant fear, all of it corroded the mind. Soldiers began to lose the ability to react clearly. Decisions became slower, reflexes failed. And in war, that kills. Some simply stopped. They would sit in the snow, too exhausted to continue. In some cases, companions would try to lift them, shouting and shaking their bodies. But when someone reached that point, often there was no turning back. They stayed there, and the cold finished the job. Others began to act unpredictably. Panic attacks would occur in the middle of the night. Common sounds were interpreted as imminent attacks. The constant stress created a feeling of permanent danger, as if death were always just a few steps away. And often it was. Trust in the leadership was also beginning to deteriorate. Orders to hold positions at all costs seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. For the soldiers on the front lines, this wasn't strategy, it was condemnation. They knew they were poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and facing impossible conditions, but still, they had to stay, and that created resentment, silent but growing. The idea of German invincibility, so strong at the beginning of the war, now seemed distant. The enemy had not been defeated. On the contrary, it was stronger, more adapted, more present than ever. And worst of all, it was the feeling of being trapped in a hostile, frozen place where each day seemed the same as the last, where there was no significant progress, no clear victory, only continuous suffering, with no end in sight. Letters from home, when they arrived, brought memories of a life that seemed increasingly distant. For many, that other reality no longer existed. There was only the cold, the war, and the constant struggle not to disappear right there in the middle of the snow. And so, little by little, the fighting spirit wore off, not in a single dramatic moment, but in thousands of small moments. A soldier who doesn't get up, another one who doesn't react, another one who no longer believes. The war continued, but the man who fought within it was fading away. And when an army's morale begins to die, the rest is just a matter of time. It was there, in that white inferno, that something changed definitively. It wasn't a single shot, it wasn't a single battle. It was a sequence of failures, losses, and attrition that together created a point. Impossible to ignore. The war had turned. Until then, Germany dictated the pace. It attacked, advanced, dominated. But now, it reacted. It retreated. It tried to survive. And that changed everything. The failure at Moscow was not just a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of an idea. The idea that the Soviet Union would fall quickly. The idea that the German army was unstoppable. The idea that this war would be short. None of that was true anymore. Winter had exposed all their weaknesses. Supply. Lines were at their limit. The army was exhausted, equipment destroyed, men frozen, units fragmented, and meanwhile, the enemy grew. The Soviets not only resisted, they learned, adapted, and began to master the pace of the conflict. New troops kept arriving. Industry moved out of German reach, mass-produced weapons. The Red Army ceased to be a disorganized force and became a resilient war machine. And now, they were moving forward. What was once territory conquered by the Germans was beginning to be retaken. Slowly, yes, but steadily. Each German retreat left behind not only land, but also equipment, supplies, and men who could not keep up with the retreat. The weight of the war was beginning to shift, and there was something even deeper going on. Perception. Inside Germany, the propaganda still spoke of control, of resistance, of eventual victory. But on the front lines, the soldiers knew. They felt it. They saw it. The war was not being won. And perhaps it could no longer be defeated. Commanders faced increasingly difficult decisions: hold positions or retreat, sacrifice men to buy time, try to reorganize, or simply avoid total collapse. There were no easy choices, only consequences, and they all cost lives. Winter had not only halted the German advance, he had broken the momentum. Without speed, without surprise, without absolute dominance, Germany now faced what it had most avoided: a long war, a war of attrition, a war that favored exactly the type of enemy they had underestimated from the start. And at that moment, even though many didn't fully realize it yet, destiny was already beginning to take shape. Because wars of this kind aren't decided in days, they are determined in their resistance. And the Soviet Union had proven that it was ready to resist, while Germany was slowly beginning to give way. The turning point was not a moment of glory, it was a moment of reality. Free, ruthless, irreversible. When the snow finally began to melt, months later, what emerged was not relief. That was the truth. As the ice receded, the battlefield revealed all that had been hidden during the winter. Bodies appeared by the thousands, preserved by the cold, scattered across roads, forests, and open fields. Many were still in the positions in which they died, holding weapons, kneeling, lying down, as if time had frozen the last moment of their lives. Abandoned tanks emerged from the ice like steel skeletons. Trucks, cannons, equipment, all left. Behind, a silent trail of destruction, stretching for miles. It didn't just look like a military retreat. It looked like an army being devoured. The Russian winter had not only delayed Germany, he had destroyed something much deeper, the illusion of invincibility. Operation Barbarossa, which began as the largest and most ambitious invasion in history, ended its first phase as a brutal warning, no matter the size of the army nor the strength of its weapons. There are forces that cannot be subdued, and nature is one of them. But Winter did not fight alone. He found an army willing to resist, a people willing to sacrifice everything, and a leadership that, despite its own mistakes, managed to keep the country standing. The combination was devastating, and the price was incalculable. Millions of lives were lost, soldiers who never returned home, families who never received answers, men who disappeared in the ice, without a grave, without a name, without a farewell. What happened? There was not just a battle. It was a silent massacre, a frozen massacre, and its consequences reverberated throughout the war. From that moment on, Nazi Germany never fully regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. The conflict would drag on for years, becoming increasingly brutal and costly, until it finally ended with the fall of the regime that had started it all. But the seeds of this defeat, they were planted there, in the cold, on the sky, in the deadly silence of the Russian winter. And even today, this story remains a powerful reminder. You can't win a war with force alone. The impossible cannot be achieved through ambition alone. And sometimes, the greatest enemy isn't the one who shoots back, but the one who waits, patiently, until you can no longer fight. In the end, what happened on the frozen plains of the Soviet Union was not just a failed military campaign. It was a brutal clash between arrogance and reality. Nazi Germany entered that war as an unstoppable force, driven by the ambition of Adolf Hitler, convinced that it could bend the world to its will. Its armies advanced like a storm, destroying everything in their path, crushing enemies, accumulating victories. But in the East, they found something different. Something that could not be contained. It couldn't be bombed. He could not be defeated with speed. They encountered the endless vastness of the Soviet land, the resilience of a people who refused to fall, and above all, they encountered the Russian winter, a silent enemy, ruthless, indifferent to human strength. There, every strategic mistake became fatal. Every kilometer advanced without preparation took its toll. Every decision based on overconfidence turned into real suffering, into frozen bodies, broken armies, and shattered dreams. What began as a lightning invasion ended as a desperate fight for survival. And in that process, something essential was lost. The initiative, trust, the certainty of victory. Under Joseph Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union not only resisted, it absorbed the blow, adapted, and returned it with even greater force. Winter gave them time. Time gave them strength. And that strength would change the course of the war forever. Because wars are not won solely by those who attack first. They are defeated by whoever resists the longest. And there, in that white inferno, Germany began to lose exactly that. Resistance. The snow covered the mistakes. The ice preserved the dead. The silence swallowed the screams. But history has never forgotten. What happened there echoed throughout the rest of World War II. Every subsequent battle on the Eastern Front bore the marks of that winter. Every later Soviet advance was built upon German failure at that moment. It was there that the myth of invincibility died. It was there that the war changed direction, and it was there that the fate of the Third Reich began, silently to crumble. Because in the end, it wasn't just the cold that defeated Hitler's armies. It was the fatal combination of unbridled ambition, utter unpreparedness, and an enemy who never gave up. An enemy that fought with men, with steel, and with time itself on its side. And so, in the vast frozen lands of the East, one of history's greatest lessons was etched. No army is invincible, no plan is perfect. And when man challenges forces greater than he can comprehend, the fall is not quick. She is slow, painful, it's inevitable.